Good morning, folks. I am going to touch on some important concepts that you're going to need to keep in mind for week three's assignments. But before I do that, I want to talk about week two. Your discussion board had you focusing on the elements of how nurses needed to balance science and the art of nursing, and the ability to intentionally practice evidence-based practice at the same time of keeping patient-centered care being in the center of your focus. Your classmate Elliot wrote in his discussion board that culture, spiritual, and psychological needs of patients can be as important to clients' health as physical needs, and it's important to motivate patients to be vocal about their concerns and values. In a field where the main goal of the health of the clients, patients should always be encouraged to be active participants in planning for their health. Historically, nurses have been the cause of great change in healthcare. Nurses supply the patients with resources and provide education necessary to make informed decisions in care. One very specific way to aid in merging the science with care is to quantify subjective observations. An example of this is the use of numerical scales to score a patient's pain. This allows for an individual experience to be more scientifically studied. That being said, though, it's important to always strive to see the patient as an individual, not pure data. I think what Elliot is getting at here is that fine balance of being very patient-centered, of asking about the patient's experience and asking about the patient's preferences, and finding a way to translate that into active practice. How do we show empathy and concern for a patient's level of pain and be present in the moment when they're experiencing pain, while at the same time accurately measuring and tracking that pain and its response to whatever intervention is ordered by the medical team. So many of you talked about how important it was to always keep the first thing first, and that for our practice is the patient, and that real challenge of keeping the patient at the center of our care, of the nurturing and the kindness and the patience, how hard those soft skills can be when staffing is limited or the demands of the job, the tasks that we're called to do can be exhausting. I was so impressed with how well you all explored that concept and how optimistic I can feel because you guys are really focusing on how do I do this and do it effectively. So I appreciate Elliot's insights and those of you that were really dialed into this discussion board as well. As we transition this week, last week you were focused on developing part one of the project of coming up with your PICO question. The biggest concern I have for some of you is your APA formatting and identifying scientific and research sources. So just a quick pause on week two. If your PICO part one was not fabulous and you wobbled a little bit, get with me during my office hours or send me an email and let's work through getting that part one tweaked and where it needs to be. The expectation for this assignment is that it's progressive, that you'll take the feedback that was provided for part one, you'll polish that up and you'll make the corrections that were recommended, and then you'll start with part two. It is so important that you make changes to part one, so when you submit the next iteration of your paper, you're going to be submitting a corrected draft. So the idea is when you get to the end of this assignment, before you do your digital poster, you're going to have a polished draft of a really good paper that meets the expectations of the assignment. This part one is only 5% of your grade because we knew it would probably be one of the more challenging assignments. So know that we're aware of that, or that I'm aware of that. Part one will not be turned in with part two. Part two is your annotated bibliography. This is going to be the tool you use to complete part three and part four. So keep in mind that you have a little bit of time to clean up part one. If you don't have time to do it this week, that's okay. You're not going to turn it in. You're going to turn in your annotated bibliography to me. It is important that you read the feedback from part one, because if you need to tweak your PICO question, you want to make sure you're pulling articles that are appropriately topicked for part two. So first, let's talk about the basic expectations for an APA paper. I am going to post this sample paper in our textbook and resource tab within our course so that you can have a look at this. I'm not going to go through this entire thing because you guys are all grown up and you can read it, but I do want to highlight some key elements that I want you to be mindful of as you work through the APA process for this project. This is your title page, and you're going to have a running head. You're going to have your page number that starts at 1, and you're going to have your title of your paper, the authors that are involved in your group, and the name of your university. Those are the only 5 elements that occur on your title page. There need to not be abbreviations on your title page as well. This needs to be a clean copy. It needs to be located at the top half of your paper, so you can read through this. We move on to page 2. Right now, you have not added an abstract. Typically, an abstract is the last thing you put on your paper before you submit it for review, primarily because the abstract should tell the story of the purpose of your paper, the background, the methods you used, and what you found. You're not going to have all of your methods and your findings until you're done with your paper. So the abstract is normally something that you go back into your paper and you add. I have it here because I want you to know what the expected format is and to understand that it is located on page 2 of a professional paper. So let's move to page 3. Right now, page 3 is going to be your page 2 because you don't have an abstract. Know that. So make sure your page numbers are trending correctly. I want to point out that your header, your running head up here, is different. You notice that on page 2 and forward, the words running head do not exist. Okay, it's just the header of the paper. So keep that in mind. So this is the beginning of the content of your paper. There's always a level 1 heading at the top of the beginning of your paper, and it is most often the name of your paper. Every once in a while, if you're writing a paper that has chapters, this may vary a little bit, but for your purposes, the first page of content is going to be the title of your paper. I want to remind you that when you do in-text citations, that your in-text citation should include the author and the year, and if it is a direct quote, the page or the paragraph that that direct quote is located. If you have mentioned the author's names in your sentence structure, then you do not have to also add it at the end as an in-text citation. So if you wrote a sentence that said, according to Smith and Jones, parentheses 2018, comma, the authors found that student satisfaction was increased when their professor sent them a video, period. You do not then again put parentheses Smith and Jones, comma, 2017. Okay? If you've said it in the body of your paper, you do not again repeat it at the end of that sentence. You only have to put it in the body of that sentence or at the end. It's one or the other. The other thing I want to caution you against is adding the title of the article or the title of the journal or the book in the name of the body of your paper. That's the reason that you have in-text citations. You have the author's name with the date. So someone will know, okay, if Smith and Jones said this, then I can go to the reference list and I can find the name of the article that information occurred into. That really gets to flow and readability of a paper, whereas you're reading it, you don't want to stop constantly and have the names of articles written. It defeats the purpose of having an in-text citation, and it disrupts the flow and movement of a paper. So you want to just use the authors with the appropriately listed in your paper using an ampersand, not the word and make sure that you have the correct date. Remember that in in-text citations, they vary depending on if they have one or two authors, or 3, 4, 5 authors, or 6 or more. So I've highlighted the table. Table 6.1 is the table in your APA manual. I'll also go over and show you Purdue, the site that Purdue University maintains that gives you a really good source. If you, for some reason, have chosen not to buy the APA book, that's okay. But you've got to know where your online resources are to make sure that you understand that the in-text citation format for 1 to 2 authors is different than 3, 4, and 5, and is also different than 6 or more authors. I know that feels tedious, but it's important for you to get that correctly so that you're following APA and it's easy to locate your articles in your reference list by properly citing them. Okay, this page gives you a little bit of information about what a reference page is, so you can read that. We're going to scroll to the actual reference page. So here's a reference page. I want to remind you that the format for a book is different than what it is for an article. And the elements for an article are really important that you get them. And one of the key elements for all scholarly articles is a DOI. And you can see in Bandura that I've added the DOI, and this is the proper format. Sometimes DOIs are reported as HTTPS links, and that's going to be down here under Fritz, where you can see the HTTPS, // and then the DOI. That's another way you may find them, and that's going to be how you report it. You don't have to put retrieved from, even though our brain says, hey, that's a hyperlink. You don't put the retrieved from in front of that. Now, if it's an actual hyperlink, which we have down here in Goodrich, is you put retrieve from and the hyperlink. So this gives you a general idea of how these things should look, and to understand that the elements of making sure that your research article has the author's names, the year it was published, then the title of the article, the journal name, fully printed out. You're not going to abbreviate a journal article name. That you're going to add the volume and the issue and the page numbers that were occurring with that article, and then you'll add the DOI or the hyperlink where you found that article. This allows us to accurately and easily locate the article that you have cited in your paper. Know that I'm going to go through your reference list, and I'm going to make sure that the sources that you're using are scholarly, that they have been published in the last 5 years. That's an APA rule. So the last 5 years they need to be published. They need to be, for your annotated bibliography, they need to be substantial research. They need to not be commentaries or editorials or opinion pieces. And in just a moment, I'll give you some examples of how you can figure out which is which. So if your articles are published in the last 5 years, they're from a scholarly source. They're not a web link. They are not found in Google, that they're actually from a research database. You're more likely to have success in locating articles that are going to be appropriate for this assignment. Know that your background, that part one, did not have to have just research articles. It was okay for you to use government websites that had fact sheets about a disease, or use the CDC's, which is the CDC website, which is another government website. But those are scholarly sources that are acceptable for background data. They're not acceptable as part of an annotated bibliography. The purpose of your annotated bibliography is for you to go into the current research, to go into the literature that's been published about your NURS sensitive indicator. Okay, so one thing I want to point out on this reference page, you can see that Bandura, the article that was published was 1993. And you may be going, well, Dr. Hudgens, you just told us we couldn't use old stuff. I did. Here's the exception. Sometimes there's seminal literature that occurs in the body of science that is its earliest point of discovery. Bandura first published this article about self-efficacy and development in 1993. Because Bandura is a scientist and his work has encompassed several decades, this is the first iteration or the first occurrence of when he published the concept of self-efficacy. So this is what we call seminal literature. It's the first of something. Let's say you were writing a paper for English and you had to quote something from Shakespeare or, Ernest Hemingway, the old stuff. That is content that is seminal. It's their first iteration of a product, and that is going to be reported in its original form, and it's okay to use that. For our purposes, unless you're reporting a seminal finding, which I would be highly surprised if you did, the only way I can think about that you might run into it is if you're looking at a theory, which I cannot imagine anyone's intentionally going to go look up a theory, but in case you do, a theory may be appropriate. But outside of that, you really need to be posting articles that have been located in research, through research findings in the last 5 years. So I'm going to post this for you on our website, on our discussion board, not a discussion board, on our Blackboard site, so that you do have this to follow if that is helpful for you. Excuse me. Okay, so this is the Purdue website. This is already hyperlinked in there. You can go in here and you can type in whatever it is that you're looking for so that you can you can look up certain topics. There's a search feature here. I'm not going to take time to do that, but I do want to remind you, if you don't own the OPA manual, you can come in here and you can look up how things are, how to format things. And it's under APA formatting and styling. If you want to just go in the in-text citation basics, this is where you go. And it gives you examples. It tells you exactly what you're doing, types of quotes, long quotes, and how to manage that. So all of that is here for your review. The next thing I want to show you is this is an article that I found that I think is really interesting. It was published, PubMed published it. It is located in several search engines, and it looks pretty good when you read it. Excuse me. Lots of good information in this article. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, wow, this stuff is pretty relevant. What I noticed from the article, it is not a research article. This is a commentary. This author went through and gave his or her opinions on the value of undergrad research. They did an analysis. They looked at the pros and cons of research. But as you go through this, you note that there are no level headings. There's no breakup of the methods section or the results section or the discussion section. None of that's here. And you can go through it and you can read through and go, wow. And he has references. You would think that Dr. Hunter, in his writing, this is something that you could use, but not now. This would be great if you wanted to use it as a background article or to fine tune or kind of exclamation point a key idea in your reflection or your discussion section. This is not a research article, and it would not be appropriate for you to use this as part of your annotated bibliography. And folks, that does not mean that these commentaries and editorials, brief reports, those smaller analysis that are done by really smart, capable people aren't relevant. That doesn't mean that at all. Our purpose is to look at the research in its original form as primary sources through the research process. And that's the key that you should be looking at here. While this article is interesting, may be relevant to someone interested in the topic, it's not a research article, and this should not appear in your annotated bibliography. Neither should websites. All of your articles should be original research, and they should have all of the key elements for research. Okay, so let's look at the other article. So this is an actual article. This is one of the few chances I get to brag on myself. I wrote this. So it was published in 2016. So if you were studying resilience, you could include this in your annotated bibliography. None of you were studying resilience, so I should not expect to see myself in your annotated bibliography. What I do want to do is point out the key elements that's required to be included in a research article review for an annotated bibliography for this assignment. So as you can see, there is an abstract. It's right here in the center of the page. I have an introduction. I have a background. My methods are clearly described. My results are described. I have pretty tables. I have more tables. Then I have the limitations, which you're not being asked to do as part of your annotated bibliography. We know that there's lots of limitations. Mine was a full study, so I did add limitations. And then I added the implications for nurse leaders. The implications for the nurse leaders is the discussion section that the Journal of Nursing Management considered a discussion section. So that is where all of I did this study, this is how I did it, but this is why it matters. This is why I looked at the importance of resilience and job satisfaction and job turnover. As you can see, if you look through the article, you can see that there are tables in here. I did this figure to give the overlap of job satisfaction and anticipated turnover as a common concept, which for me was a new finding. It's one of the reasons it was selected for publication, was the fact that I identified this element. Those pictures and the charts, all of those things are going to be found, are going to be, could be used in your digital poster. So begin to think as you go through your literature and you begin to synthesize your annotated bibliography, think about, how can I put this in a table? How can I maybe draw a picture with this? Because those are the elements that you're going to add to your digital poster. And here's another figure that I did that gives the synthesis of resilience within nurse leaders and the overview. So this is an example of what you could use as a format of what's expected in a scholarly article. And here are my reference lists. The article, this journal did not want DOIs reported. You have to follow the journal's recommendations for when you publish. So they were very clear about what they did and did not want and how they wanted that that approval when you were going through it. But you can see my paper was very well researched. There are tons of references. I think there were like 40 some. This was something that was, it was a year in the making. So for me, it was very important that I did it right. So I feel like it is a decent example of what research should look like. Okay, so we've talked about week 2. I've encouraged you to reach out to me if your part 1 was not as fabulous as you'd like it to be. I've reminded you that you need to clean up those odds and ends before you get too far into research for your annotated bibliography. Giving you a sample paper to look at for how to format your paper in the coming weeks when you're looking at level headings and appropriate formatting for references. And then we've talked about what's the difference between something that is research-based and what elements are expected, as well as the difference of something with a commentary or an editorial. I hope that this has been supportive and that you have a general idea of what's expected with your annotated bibliography. Just like part 1, only one person needs to submit this online. The grading feedback will be sent to you as a group. And then certainly we will work through part 2 and then before you get to part 3 and make sure you're on the right track. I hope you guys are having a good week. Know that I'm here. I know we've decided to make this a virtual class, but that does not mean you have to teach yourself or that you don't have resources. Know that I'm here and happy to meet with you at any time or talk about any concerns you have. I hope you guys have a great week. I'll see you soon. Take care.